Hi. The problem of HEMA is not the tournaments. In fact, tournaments have their own issues, but really the problem of HEMA cannot be said to be tournaments because there are a lot of groups, for example, the Association of Renaissance Martial Arts and other ones that don't really care for tournaments. Now, that might be a surprise to some of you because some of you like tournaments. Actually, I think it would be a fun idea to have a old style boxing tournament. I would not go to broken rules because I don't want to do bare knuckles, but maybe something like a modified London prize ring rule where you have MMA gloves and it has to be timed, of course, because you can't wait for the longest time for fights to end. That would be quite impractical. I don't know how they endured it back then when it was going on. But anyway, the problem with HEMA can be assumed to be how HEMA is divided from the rest of the martial arts community. There's a lot of people who still look down on HEMA, even though it's actually very amazing that you have all these throws, for example, that you find in judo and Japanese jiu-jitsu, aikido, Brazilian jiu-jitsu. I mean, like a lot of people think of the ground fighting from Brazilian jiu-jitsu, but it's really, there's a lot of standing fighting too. It's just that it doesn't get the awareness because people associate the ground fighting. But anyway, you see all this, but instead of coming from the usual traditions like judo and so on, it comes from these old boys who were martial arts experts basically in Europe. In the height of the medieval world, as well as the Renaissance and so on, even to the Enlightenment, if you want to include, well, some of the good sources of boxing, of British fencing, and catch as catch you can, and so on, and even America. But America's for a different discussion because, like, a lot of times people tend to dismiss American martial arts as a extension of European traditions. There's some truth to that, but that's because America comes from Britain. Surprise, surprise, right? So personally, I like American martial arts, but that's going on a tangent. So what's the problem with HEMA? Well, there's a lot of people who think they're better than they actually are. There's a lot of people who train, and there are some people who don't know anything about the manuals or the theories. Some people are too focused on that, but they forget to actually train. As a result, you have a lot of people who don't really know what they're doing, whether it's because they research so much that they forget to train, or they train so much they forget to research. So, extending this problem, I think it's more of a pedagogical problem. I think that HEMA has basically failed to teach looking at the manuals. Now, I think the reason why is because a lot of people who say look at the manuals often do it from a historical lens. For example, this book is not so much a good example because, like, the works of George Silver are more theoretical. But you take this book from the Lekanauer tradition, you see people will look at the techniques, they'll look at the different guards, the striking, the wrestling for Talhofer and uh, Bauman's Fact Book. You see them take all this stuff and treat it like you have to do it this way. Well, the problem is when you do this, yes, you are getting the techniques. No doubt, you are getting techniques. You may not understand how to do the techniques, but you still get the techniques. The important thing is that you get the building blocks. The interesting thing is the foundation and core of all the arts of fighting, or the longsword gloss of G.N.M. manuscript 3227A, actually has a reference to Aristotle. Now, as someone who's studied philosophy, actually, my thesis was on Aristotle, on his use of abductive reasoning and so on, and his methods. I look at that actually with excitement, because, well, when you actually read the text, he gets Aristotle a little bit wrong. He talks, but he has this point of using what is contrary to whatever to win, right? So, like, you go strong, you go weak, or stuff like that. Then when you look at George Silver, he talks about what would plausibly work, or what is more probable than what. He uses dialectic to explain the paradoxes of defense, the English martial arts. Of course, you see some techniques in there too. He criticizes, of course, the Spanish system, the Italian system, and so on, and he puts forth his system. And I think in Godino, he references the need to learn Cicero and Diophysis. In Agrippa, he has a lot of debates with the philosophers. There's actually a dialogue in the book after he goes through all these techniques and so on. He talks about his geometries of the sword, and explains the principles that are important to know how to defeat someone with a rapier who might be stronger than you, and so on. There are other manuals which have similar ideas of talking about the principles, talking about philosophy, using philosophy in the martial arts. But you don't see this happen a lot in HEMA. You'll be like, but the manual says this, or the manual says that. Well, that's because HEMA is still in its stage of, and it's not a stage that can easily be overcome, because it's basically inbred into the HEMA DNA, but of treating it as a museum piece. No, don't do that. If you're doing historical European martial arts, whether you're starting or you've done it for many years, I know I've done it since I was 14, and I'm 33 right now. What you want to do is read. I don't care, just keep reading. But instead of taking this approach of, but the master said this. No. What you want to do is think for yourself. If you don't have confidence in dialectic, I do have other channels where I talk about logic and stuff like that from a medieval perspective. I will start posting similar videos to this channel, or I could link down stuff and really help people out. Whatever is helpful. But remember to be aware of the Aristotelianism, be aware of humanism and Stoicism, and medieval philosophy, ancient philosophy in general, Renaissance philosophy, and just analyze your techniques. Take from the masters the principles. Take the techniques too, especially if you're a beginner, or if you're advanced and you're trying to re-examine things. But take the principles, put them together, and spar, learn. You take the intellectual and the pragmatic, you put them together. You can do that. And it's basically how you can fix HEMA. Remember also, when it comes to self-defense, one of the big things is to not put yourself in the situation to begin with. Do not be rude to people enough to start a fight, or avoid places where it's likely that a fight could occur. And keep an awareness at all times, and work on your courage, and so on. At some point, you will have the ethics of a gentleman from Georgian or Victorian England, or you will have the ethics of a knight, the chivalry, or of an ancient Roman centurion or legionnaire. And at that point, you will be able to navigate life and see that HEMA will benefit you both when you're training in it, as well as through your daily life. Thanks for watching. This is The Noble Art. Like, comment, subscribe.